The spring air in Harlem carried an unusual tension on March 15, 1943. While most of New York City bustled with wartime energy, factory workers heading to double shifts, mothers collecting ration stamps, children playing war games in the streets, Hans Weber moved through the shadows like a ghost haunting his own grave. The German spy had been running for 21 days now, each sunrise bringing him closer to capture, each sunset offering only temporary reprieve from the manhunt that had transformed him from hunter to hunted. Weber's journey to this desperate moment had begun 6 months earlier when he'd slipped ashore from a German U-boat off the coast of Long Island. The submarine had surfaced in the pre-dawn darkness of September 1942, its hull black against the darker ocean, while Weber rowed ashore in a rubber dinghy, carrying everything he needed to begin his mission. Perfectly forged identity papers, identifying him as Hans Weber, a German immigrant fleeing Nazi persecution. $50,000 in American currency. A sophisticated radio transmitter, disguised as a commercial radio. Encoded instructions from German military intelligence, directing him to establish surveillance of Manhattan's shipping facilities. For 5 months, Weber had lived the life he'd trained for, at the Abwehr Academy outside Berlin. He'd rented a modest room in a Lower East Side boarding house run by Mrs. Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who spoke enough German to make Weber feel welcomed and trusted enough to avoid asking probing questions about his background. He'd posed as a refugee, telling neighbors that he'd escaped Germany just before the war began, that he'd lost family members to Nazi persecution, that he was grateful for American sanctuary and eager to contribute to the war effort against Hitler. The performance had been flawless. Weber attended services at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church on Broome Street, where his apparent piety and generous donations earned him acceptance among German immigrants who genuinely had fled Nazi oppression. He volunteered at local Red Cross drives, rolling bandages alongside American women whose sons were fighting overseas, listening to their conversations about troop movements and supply shipments. He took evening classes in English at the settlement house on Rivington Street, where his dedication to learning American customs convinced instructors and fellow students that he was exactly what he claimed to be. But Weber's real work took place during his daily walks along the Manhattan waterfront, where he observed shipping schedules with the trained eye of a military intelligence officer. He noted which cargo vessels carried military supplies, recorded departure times and destinations, identified escort patterns for convoys heading across the Atlantic. Every evening, he retreated to his boarding house room, locked the door, and transmitted coded reports to German submarines lurking off the American coast, providing them with precise information about Allied shipping that allowed U-boat commanders to position themselves for devastating attacks. The intelligence Weber gathered was extraordinarily valuable. His reports enabled German submarines to sink 12 Allied cargo vessels between October 1942 and February 1943, sending thousands of tons of American war material to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Each successful attack validated the resources Germany had invested in placing Weber in New York, proved the worth of his mission to commanders in Berlin who measured success in ships destroyed and American lives lost. Weber had grown confident, perhaps overconfident, in his invisibility. He'd established routines that made him appear to be exactly what New York's immigrant communities expected. A German refugee, grateful for American protection, working odd jobs to support himself, sending money to relatives he claimed were hiding somewhere in occupied Europe. His English had improved to the point where his accent seemed authentically immigrant rather than suspiciously foreign. His knowledge of American customs had deepened through months of careful observation and practice. That confidence had made him careless about radio security. Weber had begun transmitting for longer periods, had grown comfortable using his equipment in the same location at the same time each evening, had stopped varying his transmission frequencies with the paranoid discipline that German intelligence had drilled into him during training. He'd forgotten that American codebreakers were working around the clock to penetrate German communications, that the FBI had established monitoring stations throughout New York specifically to catch transmissions like his. February 20th, 1943, had shattered Weber's world in the space of 30 minutes. He'd been preparing his evening transmission when Mrs. Kowalski knocked on his door, her voice urgent and frightened. "Hans, There are men asking questions downstairs. Men with badges. They want to know about everyone in the building. Weber had understood immediately. The FBI had traced his radio signals, had narrowed their search to his neighborhood, were systematically checking every building until they found him. Weber had grabbed his emergency kit, false papers, cash, and a concealed pistol, and escaped through his room's fire escape window while FBI agents were still climbing the stairs to his floor. He'd heard Mrs. Kowalski's surprised cry as federal agents burst into his empty room, heard furniture being overturned and floorboards being torn up as they searched for evidence of his espionage activities. By the time they discovered his radio equipment hidden behind a false wall, Weber was already 6 blocks away, moving through the Lower East Side streets with the desperate efficiency of a man who knew his survival depended on disappearing completely. For 3 weeks, Weber had used every safe house he'd established, every contact he'd cultivated, every escape route he'd planned during his months of careful preparation. But the FBI manhunt had proven more systematic and more thorough than German intelligence had anticipated. One by one, Weber's resources had been eliminated. Safe houses were raided within hours of his leaving them. Contacts were arrested or disappeared. Money drops were watched by federal agents who photographed everyone who approached them. Weber had watched his network collapse with the horrified fascination of a man witnessing his own execution. Americans he'd thought of as sympathetic to Germany. Immigrants who'd seemed willing to assist someone they believed was fleeing Nazi oppression revealed themselves to be loyal Americans who reported suspicious behavior to authorities. The country that had sheltered him was simultaneously hunting him with a determination that spoke to national unity. Weber hadn't fully understood when he'd been trained to exploit American divisions. By March 15th, Weber had one option remaining, one possibility that FBI surveillance hadn't yet penetrated: Harlem. Federal agents had focused their manhunt on white neighborhoods where Weber had operated, had concentrated their resources on areas where German immigrants lived and worked. They'd been less aggressive in pursuing leads that took them into black communities, partly because of jurisdictional uncertainties about operating in areas controlled by local criminals, partly because of institutional racism that made federal agents reluctant to conduct intensive investigations in neighborhoods they considered outside mainstream American society. Weber had learned about Bumpy Johnson through criminal contacts he'd cultivated during his months in New York, small-time smugglers and black market operators who'd unknowingly provided him with information about security procedures at Manhattan docks. These criminals had spoken of Johnson with a mixture of fear and respect, describing him as a man who controlled Harlem like a medieval lord, who commanded loyalty from residents that no federal authority could match, who had corrupt police officers and political connections that made him nearly untouchable. The plan Weber had developed was born of desperation, but seemed logical given his circumstances. Johnson was reportedly willing to hide anyone for sufficient payment, had resources that could keep Weber safe until he could arrange passage to Mexico or South America, represented Weber's last chance to escape the FBI manhunt that had eliminated every other option. Weber had convinced himself that Johnson's criminal status would make him naturally sympathetic to someone fleeing federal authority, that shared opposition to law enforcement would create alliance between them. Weber had failed to consider that Bumpy Johnson's relationship with American authority was more complicated than simple criminality. Johnson was an American criminal, not a foreign agent. His conflicts with law enforcement were domestic disputes, not international betrayals. He operated within American society, not against it, and his success depended on maintaining relationships with community leaders, political figures, and even police officers who respected his role in maintaining order within Harlem's boundaries. March 15th, 9:30 p.m. Small's Paradise pulsed with the energy that made it the unofficial capital of Harlem nightlife. Musicians from the Apollo Theater, mixed with numbers runners and policy bankers, factory workers who'd finished late shifts, shared tables with soldiers on weekend leave from training camps in New Jersey. The restaurant served as neutral ground, where different elements of Harlem society could interact safely, where business could be conducted without fear of outside interference, where Bumpy Johnson held court like a king receiving subjects in his palace. Weber had studied the building's layout during reconnaissance walks through the neighborhood. had noted entrance and exit points, had observed the patterns of Johnson's security arrangements. He understood that approaching Johnson directly represented enormous risk. A white stranger appearing uninvited at Johnson's table could be interpreted as threat or insult, either of which might result in Weber's immediate death. But desperation had overwhelmed caution, and Weber had concluded that directness might actually serve him better than deception, that Johnson would respect boldness more than subtlety. Weber entered Small's Paradise, wearing clothes stolen from a Harlem laundromat, a worn but clean suit that made him look like a working man rather than a vagrant, a fedora pulled low to shadow his features, shoes that had been polished to suggest respectability despite their obvious age. He moved through the crowded restaurant with careful confidence, acknowledging other patrons with brief nods, avoiding eye contact that might seem challenging or suspicious, making his way toward Johnson's corner table with the measured pace of someone who belonged in these surroundings. Bumpy Johnson sat at his regular table like a general commanding from headquarters, surrounded by 3 lieutenants who served as advisors and bodyguards. Johnson wore an impeccably tailored suit that had cost more than most Harlem residents earned in 6 months, a diamond ring that caught light from the restaurant's chandeliers, and an expression of calm authority that suggested complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever situation might arise. He was eating slowly, conducting quiet conversations between bites, radiating the kind of power that came from controlling an empire built on respect, fear, and carefully maintained relationships. Weber approached Johnson's table with the careful deference of a man who understood hierarchies, who recognized that he was asking for audience with someone whose word was law within these walls. When he reached speaking distance, Weber removed his hat and spoke in accented English that he hoped would suggest European refugee rather than German spy. "Mr. Johnson, my name is Hans Weber. I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I have a business proposition that could benefit us both significantly." Johnson looked up from his plate with eyes that had seen everything Harlem could offer and survived everything New York could throw at him. For 10 seconds that stretched like 10 minutes, he studied Weber's face, noting the military bearing that civilian clothes couldn't quite conceal, the nervous energy of a man running from something serious, the careful way Weber held himself like someone prepared for violence despite his respectful approach. Johnson's experience reading dangerous men told him immediately that Weber was more than he appeared to be, but Johnson's curiosity about what Weber might be worth made him gesture toward an empty chair. "Sit down, Mr. Weber," Johnson said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone else at the table stop talking. "Tell me about this business proposition that brings a white man into my restaurant at this hour, looking like he's been sleeping in doorways and running from something that's got him scared enough to ask strangers for help." Weber sat carefully, acutely aware that every patron in Small's Paradise was watching this conversation, that his next words would either open negotiations or end his life. He'd rehearsed his approach during days of hiding, had crafted a story that mixed truth with deception in proportions designed to gain Johnson's interest without revealing the full extent of his desperation. But sitting across from Johnson, Weber found himself facing intelligence and suspicion that made his prepared lies seem suddenly inadequate. "Mr. Johnson," Weber began, modulating his voice to carry sincerity while maintaining the accent that supported his cover story, "I am in serious trouble with federal authorities. They believe I am involved in activities that threaten American security during wartime. These beliefs are mistaken, but federal agents are not interested in explanations from German immigrants in 1943. They arrest first and investigate later, and by the time they determine innocence, a man can spend months in prison cells while his legitimate business interests suffer irreparable damage." Johnson leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing while his mind processed everything. A German immigrant running from federal agents who suspected him of threatening American security during the middle of a world war. There weren't many innocent explanations for Weber's situation, and Johnson's experience with criminals had taught him to assume the worst about people who claimed to be victims of misunderstanding. But Johnson's experience with federal authorities had also taught him that cooperation with law enforcement could sometimes serve his own interests better than resistance. "What kind of activities do these federal agents think you're involved in?" Johnson asked, his tone suggesting casual curiosity rather than interrogation. Weber had anticipated this question, had prepared an answer designed to acknowledge legitimate suspicions while maintaining plausible denial. They believe I am gathering information for Germany's military forces. This suspicion exists because I work in the shipping industry, because I ask questions about cargo schedules and convoy departures for legitimate business purposes. But federal agents see a German asking questions about ships and they assume espionage rather than commerce. The explanation was plausible enough to convince someone who wanted to believe it, reasonable enough to justify someone accepting payment to provide assistance. But Johnson noticed details that Weber probably didn't realize he was revealing. The way Weber spoke about federal agents suggested first-hand knowledge of their investigation methods. The way he described shipping industry work implied access to sensitive information. The way he carried himself suggested military training, despite claims of being a civilian businessman. Johnson had dealt with enough federal investigations to understand how they operated, had enough contacts in law enforcement to know that FBI manhunts in wartime focused on genuine threats rather than mistaken identities. If federal agents were hunting Weber with enough intensity to drive him to seek criminal assistance, Weber was probably exactly what they suspected him of being. That recognition gave Johnson opportunities that extended far beyond whatever Weber might be willing to pay for protection. "Mr. Weber," Johnson said slowly, "if you're just a businessman caught in a misunderstanding, why don't you hire expensive lawyers? Why don't you turn yourself in and explain your situation through legal channels? Why are you sitting in my restaurant offering money to a criminal instead of using legitimate methods to resolve your problems with federal authorities?" Weber's answer came smoothly, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed explanations for skeptical questions. "Because I have learned that federal agents are not interested in due process during wartime. They arrest German immigrants on suspicion alone and sort out innocents later. By the time legal channels establish my legitimate business activities, I could spend months in federal custody while my shipping company contacts assume I've been arrested for actual espionage. Business relationships that took years to build would be destroyed by weeks of imprisonment, even if charges were eventually dropped." Johnson nodded as if accepting Weber's reasoning, but his expression had shifted into something Weber missed entirely: the calculating look of a predator who'd identified profitable prey. Because Johnson understood something that Weber thought he was concealing. Weber was almost certainly a German spy, a Nazi agent carrying intelligence that federal authorities desperately wanted to capture. And that understanding gave Johnson leverage that could be worth far more than whatever cash Weber might be carrying. "I can help you," Johnson said finally, his voice suggesting reluctant agreement reached after careful consideration. "But the risk you're describing requires substantial compensation. $20,000 isn't sufficient for the kind of protection you need. I would need $50,000. $25,000 immediately. $25,000. When you reach safety in Mexico." Weber's face went pale as he absorbed the implications of Johnson's demand. $50,000 represented nearly everything he possessed, but what alternatives remained available to him? Weber reached into his money belt and counted out $25,000 in cash, placing it on the table in front of Johnson, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his efforts to project confidence. "This represents good faith," Weber said quietly. "But I need guarantees that you can actually provide the protection you're promising. I need to know that you have arrangements with police, that you can keep federal agents away from wherever you plan to hide me." Johnson smiled with reassurance that could have been genuine or could have been something entirely different. "Mr. Weber, I've been protecting people in Harlem for 15 years. Police don't search buildings. I tell them to avoid. Federal agents don't raid locations where I conduct business. You'll be safer with me than anywhere else in the country." Johnson pocketed the cash while continuing to speak in tones that suggested complete confidence in his ability to honor their agreement. "I have a safe house on 145th Street where you can stay until I arrange transportation. You'll have food, security, and complete isolation from federal surveillance." What Weber didn't realize was that he had just provided Johnson with everything the federal government needed to capture the most wanted German spy in New York City. The next morning, March 16th, FBI agent Robert Mitchell received a telephone call that would change everything about his investigation into German espionage operations in Manhattan. The caller identified himself as someone acting on behalf of Bumpy Johnson and explained that Johnson possessed information about Hans Weber, the German agent whom federal authorities had been hunting unsuccessfully for 3 weeks. Mitchell was initially skeptical. Bumpy Johnson was a known criminal whom the FBI had been trying to arrest for years. Why would Johnson voluntarily provide assistance to federal law enforcement? But the caller explained Johnson's motivation with clarity that made perfect sense. Johnson wasn't offering cooperation from patriotic duty or civic responsibility. Johnson wanted compensation in the form of reduced federal pressure on his Harlem operations. Wanted guarantees that FBI attention would focus on national security threats rather than local criminal activities. Johnson had something the federal government wanted more than his arrest. He had Hans Weber, along with whatever intelligence Weber might be carrying and whatever information Weber might provide under interrogation. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon in an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx, neutral territory, where Johnson could negotiate with federal agents without being observed by his criminal associates, or by Weber, who Johnson was hiding in the safe house he'd described. Agent Mitchell arrived with backup agents and recording equipment, expecting to negotiate with a criminal who might possess useful information. What he found was Johnson sitting calmly at a makeshift table, wearing an expensive suit, displaying no nervousness about meeting with federal law enforcement officers. Johnson had brought one associate who positioned himself near the warehouse entrance and remained silent throughout the conversation. Johnson himself spoke with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what his information was worth and exactly what concessions he intended to demand in exchange for providing it. "Agent Mitchell," Johnson began without preliminary conversation, "you've been looking for Hans Weber for 3 weeks. I know where he is because he came to me asking for protection. He's carrying detailed intelligence about American shipping schedules and has radio equipment for communicating with German submarines. He offered me $50,000 to hide him until he could arrange escape to Mexico." Mitchell maintained professional composure, but Johnson could observe excitement in the federal agent's expression. After weeks of following leads that resulted in empty rooms and cold trails, the FBI was being offered their primary target by someone who had no obvious reason to cooperate with federal authority. "What compensation are you seeking for this information?" Mitchell asked, approaching the negotiation with directness that matched Johnson's own style. Johnson had clearly prepared for this question, had developed specific demands that reflected careful consideration of what federal cooperation might be worth to his criminal enterprise. "I want written guarantees that my Harlem operations will be left alone for the next 2 years," Johnson explained. "No federal raids on my numbers runners. No harassment of my gambling operations. No attempts to arrest me for activities that don't directly threaten national security. In exchange, I deliver Weber to you, along with his intelligence materials, his radio equipment, and whatever additional information he can provide under federal interrogation." Mitchell couldn't authorize such agreements without approval from FBI headquarters in Washington, but the opportunity Johnson was describing was too valuable to refuse. Weber represented a high-priority target, whose capture could expose entire German espionage networks operating throughout the northeastern United States. The intelligence he carried could save American lives by preventing submarine attacks on Allied shipping. The radio equipment could help FBI technicians understand German communication protocols. The negotiation extended through the afternoon, while Mitchell established radio contact with his superiors and obtained authorization for the deal Johnson was demanding. FBI leadership in Washington understood the strategic value of what Johnson was offering. Capturing Weber would represent a significant counterintelligence victory that could justify temporary accommodation with organized crime figures. By 5 p.m. on March 16, federal authorities had agreed to Johnson's terms. Johnson would deliver Weber to FBI custody within 48 hours. In exchange, federal agents would reduce enforcement pressure on Johnson's criminal operations, would allow him to continue managing Harlem's illegal gambling without federal interference, would essentially grant him immunity from prosecution for nonviolent criminal activities that didn't impact American war efforts. The trap for Weber was arranged for March 18. Johnson informed Weber that escape arrangements had been finalized, that transportation to Mexico would be provided via cargo ship departing from Brooklyn docks. Weber would be taken to a warehouse near the waterfront, where he would wait until darkness provided cover for boarding the vessel. The story was plausible, the kind of escape plan that someone with Johnson's criminal connections could realistically arrange. Weber accepted the plan because desperation had eliminated his ability to evaluate risks carefully. Because 3 weeks of running had reduced his options to trusting Johnson completely or surrendering to federal capture. He packed his remaining possessions, destroyed papers that might provide additional evidence of his espionage activities, and prepared himself for the journey that he believed would carry him to safety. March 18, 7 p.m. The warehouse in Brooklyn was actually an FBI staging area, empty except for federal agents positioned to arrest Weber immediately upon his arrival. Johnson drove Weber to the location personally, maintaining casual conversation during the 30-minute drive while gathering information that would assist federal interrogators in breaking down Weber's resistance after his capture. When they arrived at the warehouse, Johnson walked Weber to the entrance, shook his hand with apparent warmth, and expressed wishes for Weber's safe journey to Mexico. Weber entered the building, expecting to find smugglers who would facilitate his escape. Instead, he encountered 6 FBI agents with drawn weapons and Agent Mitchell formally placing him under arrest as an enemy spy operating against the United States during wartime. Weber's expression transformed from confusion to comprehension to rage, as he understood that Johnson had betrayed him, that his desperation had led him to trust exactly the person who would profit most from his capture. Weber attempted to flee, but the warehouse was surrounded by additional federal agents who had positioned themselves to prevent any possibility of escape. FBI search of Weber's possessions revealed intelligence more valuable than federal authorities had anticipated. Detailed shipping schedules for Manhattan port facilities, radio frequency codes for communicating with German submarines, lists of American contacts who had unknowingly provided military information, and over $40,000 in currency that could be traced to German intelligence operations. Weber had been carrying enough evidence to expose an entire spy network that the FBI hadn't known existed. Under intensive interrogation, Weber revealed locations of 2 additional German agents operating in New York City, both of whom were arrested within 48 hours. He provided information that led to capture of German radio operators in Boston and Philadelphia. The intelligence Weber had gathered was used by the FBI to mislead German military planners, providing false shipping schedules that protected American convoy routes and saved countless Allied lives. The agreement between Johnson and the FBI proved beneficial for both parties for exactly as long as mutual interests aligned. For 2 years, federal agents reduced enforcement pressure on Johnson's Harlem operations, allowed him to expand his gambling and numbers rackets without significant interference, focused their attention on war-related investigations rather than local criminal activities. Johnson used this protection to consolidate control over Harlem's underworld, to eliminate competitors who lacked similar federal arrangements, to build the criminal empire that would make him one of New York's most powerful gangsters for the subsequent 2 decades. But perhaps more significantly, Johnson's capture of Weber established him as someone who could distinguish between criminal activities and treasonous activities, who understood the difference between fighting American law enforcement and betraying American interests. Hans Weber was executed at Sing Sing Prison on August 14, 1943, after conviction for espionage and treason against the United States. His final words, according to prison records, included curses against Johnson and promises that other German agents would avenge his betrayal. But no revenge materialized, because the other German agents Weber might have contacted were in federal custody, captured using intelligence that Weber himself had provided during interrogation. The story of how Bumpy Johnson captured a Nazi spy remained classified in FBI files for decades, finally declassified in the 1990s as part of routine document releases. Johnson never spoke publicly about his role in Weber's capture, never claimed credit for contributing to American war efforts, never used his federal cooperation as evidence of patriotism during later criminal prosecutions. To Johnson, Weber had represented a business opportunity, a chance to gain federal protection for his criminal operations in exchange for delivering a spy who had made the fatal error of trusting a Harlem crime boss. But people who understood Johnson recognized that his decision reflected deeper loyalties than simple self-interest. Johnson was an American criminal, not a foreign agent. He would break American laws for profit, but he wouldn't betray American interests for any amount of money. Years later, when civil rights activists criticized Johnson for cooperating with law enforcement, his response remained consistent. "I'm a criminal, not a traitor. When foreign spies ask for my help against my country, they picked the wrong American to trust." That distinction defined Johnson's relationship with authority throughout his career. He would resist American law enforcement, but he would assist American security when national interests were at stake. March 15, 1943, a Nazi spy entered Small's paradise seeking Bumpy Johnson's protection. 3 days later, that spy was in federal custody. His intelligence network was destroyed, and Johnson had demonstrated that American criminals and American patriots could be the same person when circumstances demanded choosing between profit and country.